want to welcome everybody to Tesla Unwired. Are you interested in the ethics of how technology is being used for national security, warfare, or environmental crises? We're going to explore this important topic on today's Tesla Unwired with Dr. Martin Hellman. Thank you all for joining us. I'm your host, Marc Alessi. I'm the Executive Director of the Tesla Science Center, and I'm honored to welcome Dr. Hellman for a discussion on a topic that impacts all of us. Dr. Hellman is a Professor Emeritus at Stanford University and a member of the National Academy of Engineering. He was awarded the ACM Turing Award, often called the Nobel Prize of Computer Science. Dr. Hellman is best known for his co-invention of public key cryptography, used to secure internet transactions and transfer trillions of dollars daily. Today, we're going to discuss the technological imperative for ethical evolution and 8 lessons for accelerating that process. Then we'll take questions from attendees. So please enter any questions or comments you have in the chat area. Dr. Hellman, thank you for joining us on Tesla Unwired.
Oh, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, Marc.
I guess I would like to just lead off with, how did you get interested in this topic, the ethics of technology?
Well, it started with the ethics of marriage. My wife and I, Dorothy and I, have been married 53 years, coming up on 54 in March. Roughly 40 years ago, we transformed a relationship where we've been madly in love when we first met, whirlwind courtship, to one where my wife was actually thinking of leaving me, although I didn't know it. I had these blinders on, as many husbands do. Fortunately, she decided not to. And it started a process where we started to look at how we behave and really become conscious about things. Like if I'd been conscious, I would have realized, I'm a scientist, I would have realized that yelling at my wife never got me what I wanted. In fact, it often got me what I didn't want. And yet I kept trying that same failed experiment over and over again. So it started there, but the group that she got us involved with that no longer exists worked on the interpersonal and the international at the same time. And the key thing internationally is how technology has changed warfare, has changed life. I mean, global warming has nothing to do with warfare, or very little, and yet it's something that threatens our way of life.
Now, give me the timetable of as you started entering this area. This was the late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s?
So, okay. I met Dorothy in 66. We got married in 67, 9 months later, whirlwind courtship. I wasn't going to get married for 15 years when I met her. That was in my head. Things change. 1980 is when she dragged me to our first meeting with this group that no longer exists, because everything was fine. I mean, I'd grown up in the New York Jewish culture. You're Italian, if I remember. And being at each other's, fighting was normal. But Dorothy, I describe her in the book we wrote as the princess and the pea of relationship conflicts, and things that I didn't even know were going on. She would pick up on, and it used to drive me crazy. Now I treasure it. But so by 1980, we were in deep doo-doo, 13 years into the marriage, and that began. And it was really took about a year till 1981 that I really committed to living my life differently, to recognizing that the way I was living my life was not working. It was leading to disaster. And I needed to change, and we needed to change as a species. It wasn't just me; it was all of us. And so it was 1981 that I really made that commitment. We haven't had a fight in almost 20 years, Dorothy and I. Even if you give us the credit of a year or two, yeah, I agree that was beyond my comprehension, and I give Dorothy the credit for that vision. But even if you say it was 2000, which is generous, I think it was actually a little after that we never had a fight. We've been married for 53 years, so it took us 20 and maybe 13 years to mess it up. It took us 20 years to dig ourselves out of the hole we created. And one reason we wrote our book is hoping to help other people do the same thing faster, and also carry it over to the technological imperative for ethical evolution. I mean, technology is requiring that we do it at the societal level. What's requiring that we do it at the interpersonal level is the social acceptability and the economic acceptability of divorce. When my grandparents got married in 1900 probably for my father's parents, 1910 maybe for my mother's parents, divorce was out of the question. But you look at the divorce rate today, we're the first generation or the first couple of generations that have had to learn how to want to stay married, how to want to stay in a relationship. So we were all doing original research. It's not surprising we're having difficulty. So in 1981, let's say we committed, but it took us roughly 20 years till 2000 to the point that we stopped fighting, stopped mistreating one another. And it's not like it stopped there. We're still learning new things all the time, but that's an important milestone. And it's not like we stayed where we were for 19, 20 years. I mean, things got better bit by bit.
Now, in terms of the timing, and you applied ethical principles to reforming your marriage. This is a handful of years after you invented the crypto keys.
Right. 1976, sitting at the desk where I am talking to you now. I would keep desks a long time. Probably 1 o'clock in the morning, I came up with what's now called Diffie Hellman key exchange, right? And so that was 76. That was one of the reasons my marriage was in trouble. I mean, I had the attitude that business world was cold and hard, the family was soft and fuzzy. So whenever there was a conflict between the two, of course, business came first, which didn't work so well in the family.
I could understand that. Now, you talk about around that period of time having an epiphany. You know, the 8 principles and that you've come up with, or the 8 topics or lessons around ethics. And the first one was to not fool yourself. Can you tell me, like, was that a lesson that you learned because of your need to turn around your marriage, and then you applied it to some of your experiences with you know, the patent issues and some of the issues that you had to encounter after your invention?
Yeah. So the 8 lessons that are in that talk, and by that you're talking about the talk I gave a year and a half ago to the annual meeting of Nobel laureates, which will be in the resources that you will make available to people who want them. And also, I'm not trying to sell books. Anyone who wants, I'll mention the book several times. We've made a PDF freely available at no cost on my website. That link will also be available through the Tesla Science Center. So I had a number of epiphanies, but the first key one was in 1981. Remember, I said that was when I first saw real value. In 1980, Dorothy dragged me to a weekend seminar on the bigger issues of life. And I'll take a weekend out. There's no way I would have taken a week out. I was too busy. But by 1981, a year later, I'd started to see value in this process. And so when the next step in the process was going to a week-long seminar in the Santa Cruz Mountains here in California, I went willingly. As part of that seminar, so taking a week really to think about things is something most people don't do, and we had not done. And one of the things that we saw there was a documentary called Day After Trinity. Now, Trinity was the code name for the July 1945 atomic test, the first explosion of an atomic weapon, a nuclear weapon in the New Mexico desert. And so Day After Trinity is the day after that test. And there are interviews with a number of the scientists, engineers who worked on the Manhattan Project who are still alive. And they were all asked 2 questions. I mean, they asked more, but this is what really stuck. This was my epiphany. The first question was, why did you work on this horrible weapon of mass destruction that killed well over 100,000, probably over 200,000 men, women, and children at Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And the men, and they are all men, uniformly have the same answer: Hitler. If he got the bomb before we did, it would be 1,000 years of dark ages. And fission had been discovered in Germany by Hahn. And so we had to work on it. They get excited, they get motivated. You can see them as young men coming to Los Alamos up in the mountains in New Mexico. Well, later in the interview, in the documentary, each one of them is asked, well, when Germany was defeated in April, May 1945, and Japan was our only enemy, and they don't have to say it, you'd lost your stated motivation of Hitler. Why did you keep working? In fact, you kept working even harder. And their faces fall, they don't know why. And watching this documentary, it took me back 5 years earlier to 1976, when the data encryption standard had been announced a little bit before, and Whit Diffie and I had realized that the key size was at best barely adequate. It had a 56-bit key, which is 100,000 million keys, which sounds impossible to search. But if you can search 1 million keys per second on a chip, and you have 1 million chips, you're searching 1 million keys per second. It only takes 100,000 seconds to search 100,000 million keys, a little more than a day. And typically you only have to search half of them. So we've been trying to get the National Bureau of Standards, as it was then called, to improve the key size. It was cheap and easy to do. But after 6 months, we realized that this was not a bug, it was a feature. Not from our perspective, but from the National Security Agency's, NSA's perspective. They didn't want a publicly available cryptographic system they couldn't break. And so we had we started to go public with this. We started getting in touch with members of Congress, with the media, because that's the only way to change it. And as we're getting ready, in January 1976, 2 high-level NSA people fly out from Maryland, and they tell us, please be quiet. If you continue talking this way, you're going to cause really grave harm to national security. So I went home to figure out the right thing to do, the ethical thing to do, in keeping with the title of the talk. And while I'm trying to figure out the right thing to do, an idea pops into my head unasked. You know, it's one of these things where just, where does that come from? The idea was, forget about what's right and wrong. You'll never have more of a chance to be famous. Run with it. Now, and in the talk at Lindau, I liken it to a movie where there's a devil sitting on an actor's ear, whispering in his ear, forget about what's right and wrong, run with it. Well, at the time, I thought that I brushed the devil off my shoulder and figured out the right thing to do. But watching Day After Trinity and how these scientists were confused, why didn't I stop? In fact, Robert Wilson, who was director of Fermilab, the first director of Fermilab in Illinois, says, with everything I believed before, during, and after the war, I don't know why I didn't walk away from Los Alamos, but I did not. And I can't be for sure, but I think that they fooled themselves. Just like I realized I had fooled myself. I hadn't really brushed the devil off my shoulder. I'd only submerged him into my deep unconscious where he could work his mischief without my realizing what was going on. And that's when I vowed I would never do that again, because while I was fortunate, I'd made the right decision. And Admiral Inman, who was the director of NSA at the time, has since said it was the right decision. He's changed his mind. If I'd been working on the Manhattan Project, I could have created weapons that could destroy civilization. Now, I'm not saying they did the wrong thing by doing that, but I would have made a very important decision unethically, just as I made an important decision unethically in 1976, fortunately the right one. And I started applying that elsewhere too, like how ethical is it for me to yell at my wife when I vowed in March of 1967 when we got married to love her through good times and bad. Here it was, the difficult times, I was not loving her. And so that was the epiphany, the first epiphany, how easy it is to fool ourselves. And we do it all the time. There's nothing, I don't fault anybody for fooling themselves. I've done it myself, but we need to stop doing it. Too much is at stake.
So you vowed never to do it again. Do you still find yourself fooling yourself? Is it an evolutionary process in and of itself, that lesson number one?
I don't think I fool myself anymore, because whenever I'm conflicted, I go and I talk to my wife, and if she can't help me, someone else, which is the second lesson that you're getting to, which is get outside help. And the story that goes with that is about 5 years after I vowed that I would never fool myself again, so let's call it 1986, a CEO of a Silicon Valley startup, Lou Morris, comes to me, and he wanted to get an exclusive license to Stanford's patents in the public key area. And he said, you help me get an exclusive license to those patents, and I promise you we'll get those RSA bastards by the balls. And that's what he said. That's how he talked. He was from Philadelphia. He was a scrappy guy. Like, you know, like, I don't know where you grew up. I grew up in the Bronx, but it reminded me of that. And at that point, by the way, I'm good friends with RSA. So, why was I angry at RSA? In their paper, with the RSA algorithm, they credit Diffie and me with inventing public key cryptography. When we asked them to pay royalties on our patents, the answer from their company, and really from them and Jim Bidzos, the president, was, your patents are invalid, sue us. And it was a bluff, but Stanford largely folded. Anyway, so when so they sold their company for $250 million, and we made almost nothing from our patents. So at this point in time, not now, we're good friends now, I was really pissed at RSA, and the idea of getting them by the short hairs sounded really good to me. at an emotional level, even though I'd vowed 5 years earlier not to make decisions on that basis. So I felt like going with Lou Morris's offer was the right thing to do. We had no chance of making money otherwise. And and Stanford had no chance of making money. So if it was the right business decision, I wanted to go with Lou Morris's offer, but I was afraid I was fooling myself again. So I went to my wife and I explained my conundrum, and she said, "Oh, it's simple. Go to the technology licensing director at Stanford, Niels Reimers was his name, and he has the same business interests. He doesn't have the emotional involvement in this that you do. Let him make the decision." So I went to Niels, I explained it, and he said, "Of course we go with Lou Morris's offer. There's no other way we can make money." But I can be sure I didn't fool myself. So that was it. So in 1986, I still had to be very careful. Today, I keep learning more and more. You develop a new way of approaching life. And so it happens much less frequently. I can't remember the last time it's happened that I needed to get outside help, but I know to get it if I'm at all in question.
So the larger thing, do not fool yourself, but do not act out of emotion and anger.
Negative emotion. I mean, doing something out of love is fine. Doing something out of retribution, anger, jealousy is not.
Never comes out good
Nope.
from my experience as well. And number two is good to get somebody to check your motivations to make sure that that's not why you're doing it. Now, in your talk in front of the Nobel laureates last year, lesson number 3 was friends are better than enemies. And I think you came to this realization as you got to know the Admiral Inman.
Yeah, Bobby and
So can you tell us a little bit about how you came to that realization?
well, I've seen it many times in my life, but that was really the first time it played out. And the nice thing about that story is Inman is the guy who initiated it, so I don't get the credit. I mean, I reciprocated, but he started it. And when you're telling a story where you're the good guy, it's always a little bit questionable. When someone else is the hero, it's more believable, especially someone who is an adversary. So NSA and I were at each other's throats. Although NSA, it's a joke. It really stands for National Security Agency. But there's a joke in the DC, Maryland area that it stands for no such agency and never say anything. And the second one was really operative because we were fighting with the Bureau of Standards, but the two guys at the Bureau of Standards had worked at NSA. They'd come over and basically colonized NBS, now NIST, for NSA. And so in 1978, I get a call from NSA, from the director's office, and a woman says, Admiral Inman will be in California in a few weeks, I think it was. He'd like to meet with you if you're willing. And I jumped at the opportunity because we'd been fighting it out, shadow boxing, so to speak, never really talking to one another. And here was a chance to talk with the agency at the highest level. So he came to my office a few weeks later. We set it up. And there are two things that he told me that really stand out. The first is he looked at the top of my head and he smiled, because it was obviously a joke, and he said, "It's nice to see you don't have horns," which is how I was being depicted by the other people within the agency. Hellman's the devil incarnate. He doesn't care about national security. He's only trying to become famous, make money. I don't know what I know they thought things like that. The second thing he said to me is, "I'm meeting with you against the advice of all the other senior people at the agency. But I don't see the harm in talking." And that is, so friends are better than enemies is a throwaway. Everybody would agree with that. But it takes courage. It's risk-taking on Inman's part to talk to the devil incarnate, possibly the devil incarnate, me. And because if I'm really the devil, I'll just twist whatever he says. Right. But he said, "I don't see the harm in talking." And out of that grew initially a cautious friendship, cautious relationship, actually, which is now a friendship. I had lunch with him a couple of years ago in Austin, where he's now at the LBJ school. He was the dean there of government. And he signed a statement of support for rethinking national security, which he obviously agrees with. But if I were the devil incarnate, if I were an enemy, he wouldn't sign it even if he agreed with it, for fear that it would be misused. Friends are better than enemies.
So I want to get to the reframing and the thinking of our national security, but I want to run through some of the other lessons that you had pointed out in thinking ethically, and then I want to bring it to what is a topic that, as I've gotten to know you, I haven't talked about nuclear holocaust since I was a kid, when the Cold War was going on. I came of age in the 90s as the Berlin Wall was coming down, and we think this is behind us. And but we'll get there towards the end of this talk. You to perfect yourself ethically. Your lesson number 4 is that you have to correct even minor ethical lapses as a form of practice. Can you illuminate that a little bit?
Sure. So what I said in Lindau is, why is it that in 1976 I fooled myself over the DES key size issue? I mean, I thought I brushed the devil off my shoulder, and I realized in 81 that I just shoved him down. Whereas in 1986, when Lou Morris came to me 5 years after I'd committed never to not to make unethical decisions, I recognized that my negative emotions were involved and I needed help. What had happened, it's not like I just made that commitment and it was there 5 years later. I had been practicing daily because the real workout for me was in the marriage. Dorothy and I continued to fight in 1981. In fact, if anything, it might have gotten more so because we were dredging up things that had not been dealt with for a long time. They were like pearls in an oyster. They'd been coated over, but man, they were irritants. And so I had daily practice at becoming more ethical. And the analogy I use in the Lindau talk is it's a little bit like if you want to win a weightlifting contest. You can't just go to the weightlifting contest and try to bench press 400 pounds. You need to be working out daily and conditioning yourself, being ready for the contest. And so we can't just wait for the big ethical decisions like, should I go public with the DES controversy? Should I go with Lou Morris's offer? If you wait for those, you will not be prepared. You need to be weightlifting every day. So when those happen, you're already in the groove and thinking the right way.
So when I was, I mentioned when I was a kid, 1990s, I did something really stupid and I threw a rock through somebody's window. I'm not proud of it. And last year, as I was driving past that house in my old neighborhood that I grew up in, I stopped and knocked on their door at 2:00 on a Tuesday afternoon. So that was probably frightening in and of itself to have this man in a suit knocking on the door that they don't know who it is. But I just screamed through the door, "Did you live here in 1992?" And the lady just started laughing and opened the door. "Why are you here?" It's like, when I was 15 years old, I was stupid and I threw a rock through the window and I ran away as opposed to being responsible for it. "I want to pay you for the window." She's like, "Well, I didn't live here. Don't worry about it." But I guess I felt it was eating away at me. So that's a small piece of, it's almost like it reminded me of that show, My Name is Earl, where he had to go back and right all of the wrongs. Is that kind of what you're professing here, of going back, identifying where you didn't act ethically and trying to fix it?
When you can. Yeah, so it's like a 12-step process. I haven't been involved in a 12-step process, but there are a lot of, I know people who have been, and there are a lot of similarities. And so one is an inventory of the mistakes you've made in your life and try, where appropriate, where it won't hurt people, to make amends. And that kind of thing. I mean, it's interesting. On the one hand, you were going to do something to make it right, and yet it also would have benefited you. I mean, it was in fact, what you did, I could tell from the way you said it, it was a weight off of your chest, a weight off your shoulders. And
Sure.
so, yeah, doing that kind of thing. And part of it is recognizing that we're all human. I don't judge you for having done that. I mean, I did stupid things when I was 15 too. I mean, I did stupid things when I was 35, like yelling at my wife, and worse. But because of the nuclear weapons that you talked about, because of artificial intelligence, because of global warming, technology is requiring that we become more ethical in our behavior. And it's nice that we're given opportunities every day. I mean, like that one that you had, going to that, knocking on the door, doesn't happen every day, but I'm sure if you're in a relationship, and I think you are, you have daily opportunities with your wife, with your kids, with your coworkers. How am I going to respond? Am I going to respond the way my parents taught me, the way society taught me? Implicitly, they never said, don't get mad, get even, or get mad and get even. That doesn't work. And it worked. I found it worked so much better. And another example, Ron Rivest of RSA, I told you that they sold their company for $250 million and we made almost nothing. And one of the reasons, there were many reasons, but one of them was that they wouldn't pay royalties. I was really pissed at Ron and Adi and Len Edelman and Shamir and Jim Bidzos for a long time. But around, I don't know what it was, 20 years ago more, I realized that being angry at them was not doing me any good. It was not consistent with my approach to life. So I reframed it. You talked about that before a little bit. Up to that point, I viewed that RSA had stolen money out of my pocket. Instead, I thought about it and I came up with a way of looking at it, which I'm not saying is true, but it might be their perspective, where I was the guy that started the whole fight. Just like my wife and I, when we used to have fights, I thought it was all that crazy woman's fault, and she thought it was all that SOB's fault. And the only time we started to heal our relationship and those conflicts is when I focused on the mistakes I'd made, and she started focusing on the mistakes she made. And it wasn't something that happened all at once. I mean, it was difficult because there's still a lot of, I mistreated her, but look at what she did to me. You have to get beyond that, and it takes time, it takes training, and I've just found it works much, much better.
No, it reminds me of a chessboard. So when I was in politics, and obviously people have differing opinions on various issues, and even when dealing with partisanship, there's a little rules of the road of what is out of bounds when you're doing a political campaign, and I used to try to characterize an understanding of somebody that was in the opposition and the moves they were making as there's a chessboard. You kind of understand that people are going to move in their own self-interest within the rules of the chessboard. But once they start acting erratically and not following those rules, that's when you get really concerned. And I'm equating that, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I'm equating it to what you're saying is you were able to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and look at what their moves would have been or what their thought pattern was. And it was able to, you were able to kind of diffuse your anger because you kind of understood where they were coming from. Whether in totality they were right or wrong, you kind of understood that, and they might have rationalized it and they weren't evil people as a result.
Yes. That's the key thing. They're not evil people. And if they thought I was an evil person, they weren't right either. The approach that the group that we worked with in those days used was, if here's my perspective and here's my adversary's perspective, typically we go like this. We just butt heads. And when one of the exercises that I really liked, Dorothy didn't. I mean, she found other things that worked for her. One of the exercises they recommended is when you have a fight, it's like when Dorothy and I had a fight, once things are cooled down enough that you're in a separate room and can do this safely without her saying, yeah, that's what I told you, try to become almost like an actor or an actress in this case in a play, and where you have to play her part convincingly. And so it's safe. So I would say I just come home from work and I thought I was in a really, I had a hard day, but I was trying to be, cheerful. And Dorothy just, descended on me with all these, problems. And she'd had a hard day with the kids. She was staying home early on in our marriage. And so it just seemed to me like it was all that woman's fault. I mean, I came home and I really tried hard and she didn't do a damn thing except get mad at me. So I'd go off in the other room and I try to see, let's see, Marty came home, he'd had a tough day. He was trying really hard to pretend like he hadn't had a tough day. And I give him credit for that, but it leaked out and I picked up on it. I'm the princess and the pea of relationship conflict. I remember I'm Dorothy talking,
Yes,
with a little help from me. And I could start to see where, from her perspective, it was all my fault. Now, It's not like once I moved from my place over to this other place in a safe environment that I agree that it was all my fault. But being able to understand both positions, it's almost like being on a mountaintop looking down and getting stereoscopic vision. And it removes a lot of the emotion from it and makes it into, okay, how are we going to fix this? Problem solving instead of problem creating.
So putting yourself in the other's position, one in a marriage, but then back in the political realm and where we're taking this conversation, understanding the position or the thought patterns and of other countries would enable us to act more ethically.
Yes. So for example, Iran's a great example. we tend to and there's a section on Iran in our book that people can read in 5 at most 10 minutes, and it's all backed up by endnotes. And each section each of the international sections was reviewed by an expert in the field. To give one example, Afghanistan was reviewed by a colleague of mine and a friend of mine, Carl Eichenberry, who's a retired lieutenant general who led the coalition forces in Afghanistan. He also was our ambassador to Afghanistan. So with Iran, we tend to view our conflict with Iran through the prism of 1979, when they held American diplomats hostage in our embassy in Tehran against all international norms. Most Americans don't know it, but Iran goes back to 1953, when the CIA fomented a coup against a popular democratically elected government and instituted a police state under the Shah. Now, wait a minute, how can the champion of democracy overthrow a popular democratically elected government and install a police state? Well, as we say in the book, part of the answer is we fooled ourselves, which is lesson number 1. But once you understand how the Iranians view it, it's not that they're right, that it's all our fault, but it helps you understand that it's not good versus evil. It's not an axis of evil, to use President Bush's characterization.
And you go on, I'm thinking of a number of the excerpts that I had read from the Gulf of Tonkin all the way down to Iran. But with Iran, you go into how they justifiably can mistrust us from our actions in the past.
Oh,
and
actually, put yourself in North Korea's shoes even. After President Trump, rightly or wrongly, killed the JCPOA, the Iran deal, after Iran had given up over 90%, probably 95% of its enriched uranium to international, they shipped it out of the country. Can you see where North Korea and Iran, the hardliners in Iran, would not trust us? Right. After we've overthrown a democratic elected government in 53. And there are many other things we've done that we don't even know we've done, right. Or that we don't even know our government has done. And I say this out of love for America. My grandparents came here as poor, penniless immigrants around the turn of the last century. And here I am teaching at one of the nations in the world's premier institutions. I mean, America has been great to our family, and it's been great to each new wave of immigrants. There's prejudice against them initially, but eventually they're accepted and become part of the fabric of America. And so we need to continually evolve. I mean, that's the evolutionary part of the title of this interview, the technological imperative for ethical evolution. It's not like we were bad and we became good. It's not like we were good and became better. We're evolving. We couldn't be the way we are today in 1941 when we're fighting Hitler. But thank God we're not facing a Hitler today. And we need to take advantage of that and start moving in the right direction and not see a Hitler behind every rock.
And that's your lesson number 5, that ethics evolve. And we are not less ethical, but we're more ethical today than we were 50 years ago or even 100 years ago. We've evolved as a human race.
Alan Turing, the namesake for the award that I won, and the hero of the Imitation Game that many people have probably seen the movie about several years ago. Alan Turing was hounded to death in the early to mid 1950s in Great Britain because he was a homosexual. I mean, he committed suicide. He was given a choice between imprisonment or chemical castration through female hormone injections. He chose the female hormone injections, but whatever it was, he ended up committing suicide. And just today, I was reading Johns Hopkins University in Maryland. It turns out Johns Hopkins, who founded it, even though he was a Quaker, owned slaves. There was a story that his father had given up all the slaves before 1850, but it turns out not true. Well, Stanford has the same problem. We just renamed a bunch of landmarks that were named for Father Junipero Serra, the Franciscan friar who founded all the missions in California and enslaved the Indians. So that's why they're renaming it. But Governor Stanford himself, in his inaugural address, and this is on the California government website, so it's authentic, talks about stopping immigration of this inferior race, the Chinese, so that the superior race will not be discouraged from immigrating to California. And so what I've argued is, instead of renaming institutions and landmarks, what we ought to do at Stanford, in particular Johns Hopkins, is, as part of the freshman orientation, have some reading that would show the good things that these people have done, and by today's standards, the bad things that they've done that were not bad by the standards of the day. And then to turn it into a positive by saying, projecting themselves 50 to 100 years in the future, and say what practices that today seem perfectly normal might be seen as unethical by our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren 50 to 100 years in the future. And I proposed in the Lindau talk several of them. Can a nation kill millions of people in war and call itself ethical? Can we put a nuclear doomsday machine in the hands of fallible human beings and expect it not to go off? How ethical is that? Can we, and these are questions, people may reach different conclusions, but they're questions that need to be addressed. And global warming comes into it too, but I'll skip that one.
So I'm going to skip ahead and I'll touch upon the other three lessons that you have put forward in terms of ethics. But you talk about the nuclear threat, and one of the items I read in your papers was the mathematical model that I believe you put together with a number of other scientists of what is the quantifiable threat of a nuclear holocaust, and you attribute it to about 1% a year. But the concern there is mathematically that might mean the threat is growing because more and more countries are getting nuclear weapons and they're potentially more and more unstable. And this mathematical model means we're dealing with this within the next 10 years.
Well, we're doing, if it's 1% a year, by the way, if it's 1% over the next year, that 1% of risk of civilization being destroyed is something we really ought to be dealing with. Even if it's a tenth of 1%, one chance in 1,000 per year, is that an acceptable level of risk? So the good news is an influential congressman, Jim Cooper from Tennessee, who's the chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, has taken a strong interest in these questions. And a National Academy of Sciences study just started a little over a month ago, October 29th, which if it's done right, will address these questions. And I'm hoping if they do it right, it then can be used to wake the nation and the world up to the need and the opportunity to behave differently. Because it's not just getting rid of a threat. To get rid of the threat, we're going to have to behave more rationally in the world. We're going to have to stop fighting needless wars, because every war has some risk of escalating. Needless wars have needless risk of escalating to nuclear use. And also they cost lives and money and national prestige. And it turns out almost every war, maybe every war that the United States has been involved in recent years has been counterproductive and therefore needless. Iraq hasn't worked very well. Libya under Obama, a Democrat instead of a Republican. So this is a bipartisan or nonpartisan problem.
I was actually point out that you're an equal opportunity offender in terms of you call out electeds from all political parties in these papers, from Lyndon Johnson to,
yes.
Absolutely.
The problem is an old way of looking at the world instead of living in the realities of the nuclear age. Yeah. So
I interrupted you. I'm sorry. So
Jim Cooper wrote this in, and this National Academy study is taking place. We'll see what happens. The study will be out. The report will be out in about a year. But even without the report, I'm going to just get some. Excuse me, 1 second. Yeah, here it is. So this is a story that Jim really likes, Jim Cooper, for explaining why the nuclear threat is greater than we realize. Imagine a guy wearing a TNT vest were to come into your home, where I assume you are now, wherever you are at the Tesla Science Center. And he said, "Hey, Mark, nothing to worry about. I'm not a suicide bomber. I don't have the buttons for a button for setting off this vest. There are 2 buttons in very safe hands. You see one in Washington with President Trump at the White House, one in Moscow with President Putin. Nice, cautious people, nothing to worry about. You'd still get out of that, where you still run out of there as fast as you can." And so why, just because we can't see the weapons controlled by those buttons, have we as a society sat here for 50, 60 years complacently assuming that because the Earth's explosive vest has not yet gone off, it never will? As if confronted with that guy in the TNT vest sitting down next to you, we need to be plotting an escape route. And that doesn't mean, by the way, jumping out the window and killing ourselves if you're on the 4th floor. Plotting an escape route does not mean a discontinuous and dangerous jettisoning of nuclear deterrence. In the interim, we're dependent on it. but we need to think about how to make it safer, how to make it less risky, and how maybe ultimately to get rid of it entirely, possibly.
So being you mentioned Congressman Cooper, I know that that plays into your lesson number 8, and I'll go back to 6 and 7. Your lesson number 8 is everyone can play a role. And so, and that's kind of, that epiphany is based on how you were led to Congressman Cooper and realizing your goal of 10 years of having this study done. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when you said 10 years, it's been 10 years I've been trying to get this study done. And when Cooper first brought it up in my first conversation with him, I said, oh, that's an old website. I've given up on that. I've tried for 10, 12 years and nothing's happened. And he said, I think I can make it happen. And he did. So that's another thing. You don't know when something's going to work positively. So everybody can play a role for 2 reasons. First of all, everybody has conflicts with their girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, wife, children, coworkers. And that's the place where you can get immediate direct benefit from becoming more conscious. Because nobody likes being in, actually there are people who like being in those fights, but most of us do not. And if you do that, you will be, it's like training for the weightlifting contest. You will be in the right place to be able to make a difference when national issues come up. You'll be able to talk more effectively. If you read our book, you'll see how the 2 go together. And in Dorothy's, in my case, working on the interpersonal and the international at the same time did not take energy away from one to work on the other. They really reinforced one another. We describe that in a section called Where the Personal and Global Meet. And the other thing is people have more political power than they realize. Like the old thing is write a letter to your congressman. Well, I've got a better idea. Get several like-minded individuals together, talk to a local elected official, a mayor, a state representative, as I believe you were,
Yep.
who knows the congressman or congresswoman. Get them on board, talk with them about it, get them looking at it from this different angle, and then arrange a meeting with the congressperson. And even if that person's already on board, it reinforces it because, as you said, when was the last time someone talked with you about the danger of a nuclear holocaust? Probably never. Oh, and by the way, the 90s, when you came of age,
Yeah.
were a very dangerous decade. We think of them as nothing to worry about. The Soviet Union broke up. 1991, there was a coup attempt against Gorbachev. The Russian nuclear football was in unknown hands. 1993, the upper floors of the Russian parliament building were destroyed by tank fire because there was another basically coup attempt against Yeltsin, or Yeltsin did a coup against the parliament. It wasn't quite clear which. 1999, just to pick one more, there are many more, but 1999, when Kosovo ceasefire went into effect, a British 3-star general told an American 4-star, sir, I'm not starting World War III for you. I won't go into why he said that. But then even the 90s were dangerous. Today, we've got the Ukrainian war going on. We had the Georgian war 12 years ago. You have to expect things like that about every 10 years, it looks like. You've got presidents like Trump or Obama, pick your devil, who you don't trust being in charge of the nuclear button. It's still a very dangerous world.
Well, and that kind of gets to, I'm going to tie this into lesson number 6. Pick your devil, or the divisiveness that we've seen in not only this country, but in a number of countries across the world. Not sure if that divisiveness has been stoked as a result of technology and communication and social media. But your lesson number 6 is technology has made it essential to accelerate the evolution of our ethical behavior. Can you explain that? And am I right in thinking that, as wonderful as it is, there's a responsibility there, and there's also a potential doomsday that is coming our way as a result of technology if we don't evolve ethically?
Yeah. So what I've written elsewhere is technology has given a new global meaning to the biblical injunction. I have set before you blessing and curse, life and death. Choose life that you and your descendants might live. That was always said individually, but now as a society, we have on the one hand, nuclear weapons, bioweapons, artificial intelligence potentially on the horizon, global warming, all of which could either fundamentally alter or destroy civilization. We also have the ability to feed the world for the first time. We have the ability to bridge our language differences. I mean, I can get articles in Russian and translate them into English online, and it's good enough that I know what they've said. We are understanding psychology at another level. So the projection of the dark side on on an enemy, where the things we hate in ourselves, but we can't admit we get mad at in other people. We really are developing everything we need to build a world beyond our wildest imagination. And so which are we going to choose, life or death?
Right. Well,
By the way, it's not even if we die, I've had a much better life for living my life this way than the way I was 40 years ago. I'm a lot happier. And so I hope I don't go down fighting, but I at least like to go down fighting rather than meekly putting my head on the nuclear chopping block or the AI chopping block, whatever it is.
well, there's an interesting dichotomy there. One thinks, or there can be a thought pattern that when you act ethically, as opposed to only in your own self-interest, you become a bit of a sheep that is
A patsy.
Yeah, that is vulnerable to the wolves. So it's going down fighting by not fighting, or by trying to diffuse the fight, or am I wrong in thinking about it this way?
Well, I'm Jewish, but I've studied the Gospels, and I've actually learned a lot from them. One of the key teachings in the Gospels for me, although most Christian churches overlook it, is resist not evil. It's in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, you've heard it said of old, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, resist not him who is evil, and if someone should smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other. Almost everybody knows turn the other cheek, but they don't know resist not evil. Tolstoy, it's a long story, but Tolstoy decided that was the key to the Gospels after many years of almost giving up. Gandhi named his farm, his commune in South Africa, Tolstoy Farm. And it's kind of easy to see resist not evil, or it's easier in Gandhi's nonviolent resistance. It worked. Now, it worked because he was dealing with the British Empire, not Nazi Germany. And we're fortunate that today we don't live in medieval Europe, where you would be a patsy for living life the way I do. We live in a country where it's governed by the rule of law. There are attempts to overturn that now, but that's one reason I'm so disturbed by them and doing as much as I can to have us live by the rule of law. I don't necessarily like the way the law works sometimes, but it's better to do that than fight it out on the field of honor, as it was called, or the field of shame, I would call it today. So we're lucky. We have that ability. It's no longer being a patsy. That's an old way of looking at it, based on ideas from either 76 years ago, when my father was in the Army, my uncles were in the Navy and Army, and trying to kill those Japs and those Krauts, and they were trying to kill the Kikes, and we have to get beyond that. That's not working anymore. In fact, what I sometimes put it is, self-interest and global interest are becoming more and more synonymous, and maybe are synonymous. If we want to solve the illegal immigration problem, if it is a problem that this country has, we need to make the economies and the rule of law better in Central America.
Mm-hmm.
It's in our interest to do that.
And it's the ethical thing to do if we have the ability.
Yes. So the ethical thing is now also the practical thing. The unethical thing is now the ultimately impractical. An analogy I've sometimes used, people sometimes say the mentality of war is like the immovable object. It's a part of human nature. Whereas the survival drive, I would say, is the irresistible force. If people were to come to see, and most people don't yet understand, that the immovable object, the mentality of war, is in opposition to the survival drive. If we keep fighting wars, eventually one's going to blow up. And so if we can bring into clear focus the tension between those two, I have confidence that the survival drive would win out.
So to that end, going backwards to lesson number 7, but it's a very hopeful lesson. There is hope of humanity becoming more ethical. Where did you come up with this? So how did you come up with it?
The funnest part of that is, and it's in the Lindau talk, about 8 years ago, I was at an 80th birthday celebration for a colleague of mine, and the woman there said, "What are you working on?" And I told her I work on these issues. She said, she was polite, but she made it clear she thought I was on a fool's errand. And instead of getting mad at her, I smiled and I said, "Thank you. That's the best compliment you could pay me." And a colleague and friend, Jim Omura, was standing about 6 feet away, who had told me I was crazy to work on cryptography, as all my colleagues really had early on. And Jim had given me permission to write this and use it. So I said, Jim, come on over here. Tell this woman what you told me when I started working in cryptography. And he said, oh, I told Marty he was crazy. And so there's hope in that. Most people see this as a fool's errand. When I gave the talk in Lindau to the Nobel laureates, I had a chance to ask about 5 of them beforehand whether the work that won them their Nobel Prizes was encouraged initially or whether it was discouraged as foolish and crazy. 4 out of the 5, foolish and crazy. The best ideas always look foolish and crazy a priori. And that was true of my work. It's true of many other advances that I know of. And when Dorothy told me the things she told me, I told her she's crazy.
Right.
She was crazy like a fox.
Many of the times when Nikola Tesla made a prediction on what he was working on, he was called crazy, and he almost always proved people wrong. And there were times where he talked about generations later. So in 1926, when he's talking about carrying a device in your coat pocket that you're gonna be able to talk to everybody in the world wirelessly and send movies and messages, he was crazy. And now it has changed our lives. He saw it. And yep. So I do want to open it up to the questions in the chat. So I'm going to encourage our audience to put your questions in the chat. But before I go to those questions, Dr. Hellman, is there something to sum this up? A question that I could have asked that you feel is really pertinent to tie this together: the ethical evolution at the personal level, which you experienced through your marriage, the ethical evolution that technology, and you're a technologist, so the technology is going to force us to undergo, and then obviously the political ramifications of that.
Yeah. Well, there are many, but the one I'll pick for just 1 minute. Harry Rathbun, who was my key mentor in this area, was born in the 1890s, by the way, so he's no longer with us. He was a professor of business law here at Stanford, and Sandra Day O'Connor credits him with being the key influence in her life. Harry had been trained as an electrical engineer, and so he knew about the scientific spirit, and he defined the scientific spirit as a zealous search for the truth, with a ruthless disregard for commonly held beliefs when contradicted by observations. And just like you, he smiled when he said zealous and ruthless. Right. That's how science advances. It's like Nikola Tesla, as you pointed out. But Harry said, having gone into law, he said, we need to apply this more broadly. We need to apply it interpersonally, internationally. And if I had applied any search for the truth, much less a zealous search for the truth in my marriage, I would have stopped yelling at Dorothy long before I did, because it never worked. The experimental evidence was all there. And I have an example during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest we came to nuclear war. Not only did Kennedy and his advisors, and I'm sure the same thing happened in Russia, not seek the truth, they zealously hid from the truth. In the secret White House tapes that we only learned about later that are now declassified, and I've got the books on my shelf here behind me, the transcripts. The first day of the crisis, Kennedy's trying to figure out why Khrushchev would do something so reckless as to put nuclear weapons 90 miles off our shore. And he says, it's almost as if we put a bunch of MRBMs, medium range ballistic missiles, which we in Turkey. Now that'd be goddamn dangerous, his exact words. His national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, has to say, excuse me, sir, but we did that in the spring. Now, Kennedy had just said it would be dangerous, the same thing. He says, but that's different. He contradicts what he just said, and his advisors all get into it. And so they zealously hid from the truth. We need to stop hiding from the truth and not be afraid of it. God made us human instead of angels, and he did not make a mistake making us human instead of angels. And so we are being sacrilegious when we pretend that we have to be angels instead of human. It's like you're throwing the rock through the window at age 15, the things I did many years ago. We shouldn't be ashamed of them. We need to make amends for them and move forward. We need to zealously search for the truth with a ruthless disregard for commonly held beliefs when contradicted by experiments, by observations in our personal lives and internationally, as well as scientifically.
I appreciate that. So turning to some of the questions in the chat, we have a question actually from Doug Borge, who you met earlier today. He's the COO of Tesla Science Center. And his question is, how do you approach the use of technological ethics and balancing the collective good versus the individual good with rights and protections, using AI video tracking as an example?
Well, I think the answer is we need to recognize that there is a trade-off instead of pretending that it's unalloyed good or unalloyed evil. And we need to weigh each situation objectively with a zealous search for the truth, with a ruthless disregard for commonly held beliefs. And we'll come to different answers in different places. Good example, 25 years ago, I served on a National Academy's study on cryptography. It's called the crisis study, cryptography's role in securing the information society. And we started out, there was an assumption that law enforcement and national security interests wanted weak encryption so they could wiretap and they could spy. And what we concluded, and we had a former associate director of NSA, a former attorney general representing law enforcement's interests. By all of us putting our heads together, we eventually concluded that no, that wasn't true. There are some times when law enforcement and national security want weak encryption, but there are other times, like preventing crime and protecting American secrets, that we want strong encryption. The reason Admiral Inman, about 5 or so years ago, in an interview, he was asked whether he would still try to suppress my work with what he knows today. He said quite the opposite. With American commercial secrets being stolen by other governments and being used in ways that hurt our national security, he would try to get my work out as quickly as possible. So we need to look at the trade-offs and really get at it, question our assumptions, and sometimes it'll be tricky.
So there's another question in the chat, and I do want to get to it. But what's popping in my mind now as I hear you speak, and it's probably still a controversial topic, Snowden, NSA, listening in, he outs it. Was he fooling himself and self-aggrandizing? Was he freeing us from NSA's overreach? Or do we need to be protected? Do we need them to be doing this? It's a conundrum.
Dorothy has a wonderful expression when we try to figure out if it's A or not A, or A or B. I mean, it seems like it's A or not A. She says sometimes it's the big and. In fact, often it's the big and. It's some of A and some of B. And so I haven't studied Snowden carefully enough to form my own opinion, and I've done that almost on purpose because I have one friend, Dan Ellsberg, who people may know from the Post. He was the one who outed the Pentagon Papers at great risk to himself. Dan is a fan of whistleblowers, and he sees Snowden as a national hero. I have another friend who's tied to the intelligence community who has said he's a traitor. I mean, unequivocal. I'm not saying I agree with either one of them, but I want to maintain both of them as friends. So I haven't looked at it too carefully, just like I haven't looked at the JFK assassination too carefully or UFOs too carefully, because if I had concluded something that would cause most people to say I'm crazy, then I'll be discounted in other ways. So I think Snowden probably there's a little bit of truth on both sides, but he's certainly some of the things he's made public we needed to know about, and why they were classified is a question we need to address.
So we have a question from Kenneth Cato. I often think about how technology is made to make our lives more efficient, more convenient, but I also see there are opportunities, costs of these benefits and this design. I'd like to ask this question. What do you believe, with ethics in mind, our technology should be designed for? What type of life should technology promote with ethics in mind?
But in some sense, it doesn't matter what I think, because we have the free marketplace, things are going to happen. What I really think is we need as a society to become more aware of the technological imperative for ethical evolution, to use the title of this interview, so that we as a society will more rationally balance the trade-offs and figure out how to do things going forward. But one thing I have pointed out, one of the things that technology does is give us more time. I mean, it makes us more efficient. And yet the one thing we don't have enough of is time. Ask any American, and that'll be at the top of his or her list. And yet if you go to a peasant in rural Mexico, Central America, and ask her, do you have enough time? She's likely to say, God gave us 24 hours in the day. What more could you ask for? So why is it that we, with all our efficiency, don't have enough time and she does? That's something we need to look at.
That's absolutely the topic of an entire podcast because you're absolutely right. And why do when people retire, they end up having less time?
Yeah. And one of the
So
things I've really worked on, by the way, I find myself feeling, because there's so few of us working on these issues, I feel sometimes a weight on my shoulders. And then when I come to, I say, and the God I believe in is very different from the God that I grew up with in Hebrew school. I don't even know what it is. I mean, but I talk to this thing, whatever it is, this force, and then I remind myself, okay, if God wants me to do more, if that's part of His plan, then He needs to clone me or give me more energy. And since that hasn't happened, what I'm doing must be enough, and to stop beating myself up over it.
right.
Do what you can, but do what you can. And sometimes it's important to take time off. This past weekend, I was getting into that feeling of I'm not doing enough. And I realized I was slave driving myself again. There are two parts of me. I used to not slave drive myself. If I did something really good, I'd give myself time off. I rewarded myself. And so what I realized I needed to do was to take a day off, just a vacation. I watched 2 Pink Panther movies, which I love, Total Idiocy. And sometimes things like that are important for doing what we're supposed to do, because you can't, otherwise you'll kill yourself.
So we do have to wrap it up. We have one last question from Rich Duda. The Biden administration will have a new nuclear posture review. Are there assumptions about our national security that you think they need to re-examine? And if so, what are the major ones?
Thank you for that question. My current project is called Rethinking National Security, and when you make the resources available, there's a link to that part of my Stanford website. Over a dozen prominent people, including a former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, have signed a statement supporting rethinking national security. And here's the great key observation. In 1945, when World War II ended, the United States was absolutely secure from attack. Since then, we've invested huge amounts of money to improve our national security, with the paradoxical result that today we can be destroyed in under an hour. And as we've discussed, the probability, the risk is on the order of 1% a year. What the hell went wrong? And so I hope that the Nuclear Posture Review and the National Security Review will start to question these assumptions. Like there's an assumption that we can buy national security. Oh, so the statement that Panetta and others have signed goes on. Is it possible in this age of nuclear weapons, pandemics, cyber attacks, global environmental crises, terrorism, is it possible that national security is becoming inseparable from global security? And I would add, including that of our adversaries. And if so, how do our policies need to change? If we cannot buy national security at the expense of North Korea, then how should our policies change? We need to really question our assumptions. And there are a dozen assumptions in a report that's also on the Rethinking National Security homepage. The US is the world's sole remaining superpower. Is that even true? What does it mean to be a superpower? We need to question these assumptions, just like I needed to question whether yelling at Dorothy ever got me what I wanted, but I didn't. But we need to become more conscious, more questioning.
And we all have to get to a point where we don't have a fight with our significant others for 20 years.
Yes.
Truly remarkable. Great talk. I really thank you for your time. I hope we can do this again. I think there's a whole lot more I'd like to talk to you about.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it too. And thank you all for listening and for the questions.
All right. And with that, we'll sign off. Please visit the links on our website to all the resources that we talked about with Dr. Hellman, and we will see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.